The young brain is a plasticity machine. But then right about age 25, plus or minus a year or two, everything changes. If you get these three things, if you can access these three things, not only will the nervous system change, it has to change. It absolutely will change. And that is the most important thing for people to understand if they want to change their brain. Neuroplasticity is arguably one of the most important aspects of our biology. It holds the promise for each and all of us to think differently, to learn new things, to forget painful experiences, and to essentially adapt to anything that life brings us by becoming better. All of us were born with a nervous system that isn't just capable of change, but was designed to change. When we enter the world, our nervous system is primed for learning. And then as we mature, as we go from day one of life to 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old, what happens is particular connections get reinforced and stronger, and other connections are lost. So that's the first important principle that I want everyone to understand, which is that developmental plasticity, the neuroplasticity that occurs from the time we're born until about age 25, is mainly a process of removing connections that don't serve our goals well. What this tells us is that the young brain is a plasticity machine. Then right about age 25, plus or minus a year or two, everything changes. After age 25 or so, in order to get changes in our nervous system, we have to engage in a completely different set of processes in order to get those changes to occur and for them, more importantly, to stick around. And those processes, as we'll soon learn, are gated, meaning you can't just decide to change your brain. You actually have to go through a series of steps to change your internal state in ways that will allow you to change your brain. It's clear that we can change our nervous system, that the nervous system is available for change, that if we create the right set of circumstances in our brain, chemical circumstances, and if we create the right environmental circumstances around us, our nervous system will shift into a mode in which change isn't just possible, but it's probable. If you want to learn something or you want to change your nervous system in any way, whether or not it's because of some impairment or because of something that you want to acquire, a cognitive skill, a motor skill, an emotional skill, the first thing is recognizing what that thing is. And that often can be the hardest thing to identify. But the brain has these self-recognition mechanisms, and those self-recognition mechanisms are not vague, spiritual or mystical or even psychological concepts. They are neurochemicals. We're going to talk next about the neurochemicals that stamp down particular behaviors and thoughts and emotional patterns and tell the rest of the nervous system, this is something to pay attention to, because this is in the direction of the change that I want to make. And that's because our nervous system has two broad sets of functions. Some of those functions are reflexive, things like our breathing, our heart rate, are obvious ones. But other aspects are reflexive, like our ability to walk. If I get up out of this chair and walk out of the door, I don't think about each step that I'm taking, and that's because I learned how to walk during development. But when we decide that we're going to shift some sort of behavior or some reaction or some new piece of information that we want to learn, is something that we want to bring into our consciousness, that awareness is a remarkable thing because it cues the brain and the rest of the nervous system that when we engage in those reflexive actions going forward, that those reflexive actions are no longer fated to be reflexive. Now, there are specific protocols that science tells us we have to follow if we want those changes to occur, but that self-recognition is not a kind of murky concept. What it is it's our forebrain, in particular our prefrontal cortex, signaling the rest of our nervous system that something that we're about to do, hear, feel, or experience is worth paying attention to. If we are to change our nervous system in adulthood, we need to think about not just what we're trying to get, but what we're trying to give up. We can't actually add new connections without removing something else. And that might seem like kind of a stinger, but it actually turns out to be a great advantage. So when people tell you, oh, at the end of today's lecture or at the end of something, your brain is going to be completely different, that's simply not true. If you're older than 25, your brain will not change unless there's a selective shift in your attention or a selective shift in your experience that tells the brain it's time to change. The immediate question should be, well, why? Well, the answer is that When we pay careful attention, there are two neurochemicals that are released from multiple sites in our brain that highlight the neural circuits that stand a chance of changing. It's not necessarily the case that they're going to change, but it's the first gate that has to open in order for change to occur. And the first neurochemical is epinephrine, also adrenaline. And it's only when we are in high states of alertness that this epinephrine is released. But the way this circuit is designed, it's very non-specific. It's essentially waking up the entire brain. And that's because the way that epinephrine works by binding particular receptors is to increase the likelihood that neurons will be active. So no alertness, no neuroplasticity. However, alertness alone is not sufficient. As we would say, it's necessary, but not sufficient for neuroplasticity. Epinephrine is released when we pay attention and when we are alert. But the most important thing for getting plasticity is that there be epinephrine, which equates to alertness, plus the release of this neuromodulator, acetylcholine. Acetylcholine acts as a spotlight, but epinephrine for alertness, acetylcholine spotlighting these inputs, those two things alone are not enough to get plasticity. There needs to be this third component, and the third component is acetylcholine released from an area of the forebrain called nucleus basalis. If you get these three things, if you can access these three things of epinephrine, acetylcholine from these two sources, not only will the nervous system change, it has to change. It absolutely will change. And that is the most important thing for people to understand if they want to change their brain. You cannot just passively experience things. And repetition can be important, but the way to use repetition to change your brain is fundamentally different. So now let's talk about how we would translate all this scientific information and history into some protocols that you can actually apply. Your ability to engage in deliberate focused alertness is in direct proportion to how well you are sleeping on a regular basis. I think that's kind of an obvious one. So get your sleep handled. Once that's in place, the question then is, how do I access this alertness? Well, there are a number of ways. Some people use some pretty elaborate psychological gymnastics. They will tell people that they're going to do something and create some accountability. That could be really good. Or they'll post a picture of themselves online and they'll commit to learning a certain amount, losing a certain amount of weight or something like this. Or they'll do it out of love. You know, they'll decide that they're going to run a marathon or learn a language or something because of somebody they love, or they want to devote it to somebody. There are pharmacologic ways to access alertness too. The most common one is, of course, caffeine. Caffeine can be a relatively safe way to increase epinephrine. The truth is that from the standpoint of epinephrine and getting alert and activated, it doesn't really matter. Epinephrine is a chemical, and your brain does not distinguish between doing things out of love or hate, anger or fear. It really doesn't. All of those promote autonomic arousal and the release of epinephrine. So I think for most people, if you're feeling not motivated to make these changes, the key thing is to identify not just one, but probably a kit of reasons, several reasons as to why you would want to make this particular change. Motivation is a tricky one. So I suggest that everyone ask themselves, what is it that I want to accomplish? And what is it that's driving me to accomplish this? And come up with 2 or 3 things, fear-based perhaps, love-based perhaps, or perhaps several of those, in order to ensure alertness, energy, and attention for the task. And that brings us to the attention part. There are some important neuroscience principles to get depth of focus. The essence of plasticity is to create a window of attention and focus that's distinct from the rest of your day. That's what's going to create a mark in your brain and the potential for plasticity. So what are some ways that you can increase acetylcholine? And there, it's going to sound like a bit of a circular argument, but you want to increase focus. How do you increase focus? You know, people are so familiar with sitting down, reading a couple pages of a book and realizing that none of it sunk in. Or talking to someone and seeing their mouth move, maybe even nodding your head subconsciously and go, and none of it sinks in. This can be very damaging for school, work performance, and relationships, as many of you know. The best way to get better at focusing is to use the mechanisms of focus that you were born with. And the key principle here is that mental focus follows visual focus. We are all familiar with the fact that our visual system can be unfocused, blurry, or jumping around, or we can be very laser focused on one location in space. What's interesting and vitally important to understanding how to access neuroplasticity is that you can use your visual focus and you can increase your visual focus as a way of increasing your mental focus abilities more broadly. So I'm going to explain how to do that. So let's think about visual focus for a second. When we focus on something visually, we have two options. We can either look at a very small region of space with a lot of detail and a lot of precision, or we can dilate our gaze and we can see big pieces of visual space with very little detail. It's a trade-off. We can't look at everything at high resolution. When we focus our eyes, we do a couple things. First of all, we tend to do that in the center of our visual field, and our two eyes tend to align in what's called a vergence eye movement towards a common point. The other thing that happens is the lens of our eye moves so that our brain now no longer sees the entire visual world, but is seeing a small cone of visual imagery. That small cone of visual imagery, or soda straw view of the world, has much higher acuity, higher resolution than if I were to look at everything. Now you say, of course, this makes perfect sense, but that's about visual attention, not mental attention. Well, it turns out that focus in the brain is anchored to our visual system. The key is to learn how to focus better visually if you want to bring about higher levels of cognitive or mental focus, even if you're engaged in a physical task. What this means is that if you have a hard time focusing your mind for sake of reading or for listening, you need to practice, and you can practice, focusing your visual system. Now, this works best if you practice focusing your visual system at the precise distance from the work that you intend to do for sake of plasticity. So how would this look in the real world? Let's say I am trying to concentrate on something related to, I don't know, science. I'm reading a science paper and I'm having a hard time. It's not absorbing. Spending just 60 to 120 seconds focusing my visual attention on a small window of my screen, meaning just on my screen with nothing on it, bringing my eyes to that particular location increases not just my visual acuity for that location, but it brings about an increase in activity in a bunch of other brain areas that are associated with gathering information from this location. So put simply, if you want to improve your ability to focus, practice visual focus, and you will feel some agitation because of the epinephrine in your system. If you're feeling agitation and it's challenging to focus and you're feeling like you're not doing it right, chances are you're doing it right. And you can practice this ability to stare for long periods of time without blinking. I know it's a little eerie for people to watch, but if your goal is to learn how to control that visual window for sake of controlling your focus, it can be an immensely powerful portal into these mechanisms of plasticity, because we know it engages things like nucleus basalis and these other brainstem mechanisms. So once you get this epinephrine, this alertness, you get the acetylcholine released and you can focus your attention, then the question is for how long? The typical learning bout should be about 90 minutes. That learning bout will no doubt include 5 to 10 minutes of warm-up period. I think everyone should give themselves permission to not be fully focused in the early part of that bout, but that in the middle of that bout, for the middle hour or so, you should be able to maintain focus for about an hour or so. I encourage you to try experiencing what it is to be completely immersed in an activity where you feel the agitation that your attention is drifting, but you continually bring it back. And that's an important point, which is that attention drifts, but we have to re-anchor it. We have to keep grabbing it back. And the way to do that, if you're sighted, is with your eyes. That as your attention drifts and you look away, you want to try and literally maintain visual focus on the thing that you're trying to learn. Feel free to blink, of course, but you can greatly increase your powers of focus and the rates of learning. Now, that's the trigger for plasticity. But the real secret is that neuroplasticity doesn't occur during wakefulness. It occurs during sleep. We now know that if you focus very hard on something for about 90 minutes or so, maybe you even do several bouts of that per day, if you can do that. Some people can only do one focus bout of learning. That night and the following nights while you sleep, the neural circuits that were highlighted, if you will, with acetylcholine transmission will strengthen and other ones will be lost, which is wonderful because that's the essence of plasticity. And what it means is that when you eventually wake up a couple days or a week later, you will have acquired the knowledge forever. So mastering sleep is key in order to reinforce the learning that occurs. But let's say you get a really poor night of sleep after a bout of learning. Chances are if you sleep the next night or the following night, that learning will occur. there's a stamp in the brain where this acetylcholine was released. It actually marks those synapses neurochemically and metabolically so that those synapses are more biased to change. Now, if you don't ever get that deep sleep, then you probably won't get those changes. There's also a way in which you can bypass the need for deep sleep, at least partially, by engaging in what I call non-sleep deep rest, these NSDR protocols. So the key to plasticity in childhood is to be a child. The key to plasticity in adulthood is to engage alertness, engage focus, and then to engage non-sleep deep rest and deep sleep while you're in your typical bout of sleep.